Morning, and welcome back to the history of various hockey teams in alphabetical order series that I've been doing. We're up to the Minnesota Wild. Minnesota's really kind of a basic history in that the Minnesota Wild was the NHL's way of saying our bad, giving a team back to an area that never should have lost their team. The Minnesota North Stars, when they moved out, that was Norm Green, that was mismanagement. There's a lot of things that went wrong there. And I think the NHL knew right away they would end up going back to Minnesota. I would argue that they knew that Winnipeg would eventually come back as well. But Minnesota, it was pretty obvious, really deserved a team. More so than some of the other locations that were in the NHL at the time. So when this became team number 29 or 30, depending on how you look at it, it really didn't surprise a whole lot of people. They've been in the playoffs 9 out of 19 seasons that have been played so far, a little bit under 50%. But in recent years, they've been better than they were in the beginning. They did start out, though, as a very excellent defensive team. They've been a pretty solid defensive team through most of their run. And the one thing about the overall history of this team so far is goaltending. Goaltending. They've always had pretty solid goaltenders throughout their history. And they were awarded an expansion team, but before that, they did try to get the Winnipeg Jets when the Jets were available. That was a plan. So when they did get the expansion team, they probably did better than getting what is now the Arizona Coyotes. You look at the overall history of the Jets/Coyotes franchise, you're better off to start fresh with the Minnesota Wild, although both of them are known right now as teams that don't go very far in the playoffs when they do make them. The 6 finalists for team names. So if you look at Minnesota Wild and go, that's a weird one. Yeah, the 6 finalists were Blue Ox, Freeze, Northern Lights, Voyageurs, which was my middle school's team name back when I was a kid. And it's not that anymore because it sucked. And White Bears and Wild. White Bears could have been fun, couldn't it? Just thinking Minnesota White Bears, that could have been a really fun logo and really fun team. But Wild is probably the best name they could have come up with out of those 6. Blue Ox. Yeah. Anyways, and I know where Blue Ox would come from. It's a strange name for a hockey team. All-time leading scorers. Mikko Koivu leads the way with 201 goals, 487 assists, 688 points. And then it's a huge drop-off before you get to Marian Gaborik. 219 goals, 218 assists, 437 points. Pierre-Marc Bouchard, 106 goals, 241 assists, 347 points. You guys surely remember him. Zach Parise, 167 goals, 169 assists, 336 points. He'll pass Bouchard this year, barring injury. Andrew Burnett, 119 goals, 202 assists, 321 points. A favorite of mine, Andrew Burnett. I need to at some point put him into my Hall of Fame or something. All that guy did was go play for crappy teams, never complain, and play really well. Michael Granlund, 93 goals, 224 assists, 317 points. Ryan Suter, 44 goals, 258 assists, 302 points. Jared Spurgeon in the top 10, 70 goals, 178 assists, 248 points. Charlie Coyle is in the top 10 with 91 goals, 151 assists, 242 points. And Nino Niederreiter, 110 goals, 118 assists, and 228 points. So if not for trading Niederreiter and Coyle, it would be harder to make this top 10. It is not a stellar top 10. However, this is again a team that's been known mostly for its defense and not so much for offensive fortitude. That being said, Gaborik was fantastic as a kid. Wins, Nicholas Lidstrom 194, Devin Dubnyk 165. So if he gets 30, he gets the lead on the all-time list by this time next year. 30s, it's possible for Dubnyk, depending on how many games he plays and how well the team plays in front of him, of course. Manny Fernandez 113, Dwayne Rollison 62, and Josh Harding with 60. Coaching wins. There have only been 5 coaches in this team's history, and one of them was an interim. Jacques Lemaire, 293 wins. Mike Yeo, 173. Bruce Boudreau, 131. Todd Richards, 77. And John Torchetti, who came in as a interim, 15. As an interim after they fired Mike Yeo before they brought in Bruce Boudreau. Now, when we look at the captain's history, this is really, really easy. They had rotating captains from 2000 through 2009. I'm not writing them all out because they changed from year to year. And again, it was rotating captains. 5 a year, I believe, the whole way through. And then in 2009, they said, okay, we're going to have a full-time captain. And it was Mikko Koivu, the guy who's still captain right now. He's had some injury troubles. I don't know how much longer he's their captain. But this is a team that has been very remarkably consistent. No panic firings of coaches. Captain's history is nice and clean. And overall, their goaltending's been really good. And there are some decent names in that top 10. But of course, they traded a few of those top 10 guys out just this past season. Top 10 draft picks. There's not a lot here either, considering they've only made the playoffs 9 out of 19 times. Marian Gaborik was number 3 overall in 2000. Mikko Koivu, number 6 overall in 2001. Pierre-Marc Bouchard, number 8 in 2002. It's important to note that the first 3 draft picks in the top 10 all end up being in their top 10 leading scorers of all time. That's impressive. No busts in there. I know Bouchard could be argued as kind of a bust, but Bouchard, he never quite reached that ceiling, but then he ended up dealing with some injuries along the way too that really, it just made it so he could not be as effective as was expected when he was drafted. Benoit Pouliot, drafted at 4 in 2005. Yeah, you can call him a little bit of a bust compared to what was expected, and some of the guys drafted later. 2006, drafting 9th, they drafted James Shepherd. 2010, they drafted 9th again. They drafted Michael Granlund. 2011, they drafted, I believe it's 7th. Nope, I had to look that one up real quick. Brodin's drafted 10th in 2011. I knew it wasn't first. I'm like, yeah, they didn't draft first. I thought maybe 7th, no, 10th. 2012, drafting 7th that year, they get Matt Dumba. So Dumba and Brodin, the last 2, they were top 10 picks, and their most recent is 2012. So they have been pretty consistently good, not great. And that's kind of where things have been for Minnesota for most of their existence. They reached the conference finals in 2003, so that's 16 years ago. They missed the playoffs for their first 5 years, and from 2009 to 2012, there were no playoffs for the Minnesota Wild. And as you can see, 2010, 2011, 2012, they had top 10 picks those 3 years. Used them on Granlund, Brodin, and Dumba. Decent moves. So, speaking of moves, let's get into their trade history because we're already done all of this. Yeah. Notable trades from June of 2000 until now. June 12, 2000, Minnesota acquires Manny Fernandez and Brad Lukowich from Dallas for a 2000 third-round pick and a 2002 fourth, which became Aaron Rome. I didn't like this trade as a Dallas fan because I like Manny Fernandez. I was really kind of ticked that he went, and Fernandez went on to be pretty solid for the Minnesota Wild. And then June 25th, 2000, they kind of undo that trade and change it. So this is one of those before the expansion draft, after the expansion draft. June 25th, 2000, Minnesota adds Aaron Gavey, Pavel Patera, 2008 round pick, and they trade back that draft pick that became Aaron Rome. Dallas gets Brad Lukowich, a 2001 third and 9th round draft pick. March 4th, 2001, Minnesota gets Willie Mitchell and futures. New Jersey gets Sean O'Donnell. Willie Mitchell was fantastic for the Wild. He was really solid for Vancouver as well. One of the better defensive defensemen I've seen in the last 20 years. So that's a win for Minnesota. June 29th, 2001, Minnesota acquires Sergei Zholtok from Edmonton for a 2002 7th. That's a whoops by Edmonton. Absolutely. And I didn't even include that in the Edmonton trade history because there were a lot of trades to cover, and that one just didn't qualify as a major one for them. June 22nd, 2002, Minnesota acquires Cliff Ronning. LA gets the 2002 4th-round pick that became Aaron Rome. That draft pick moved around a lot. And Cliff Ronning had a decent run with Minnesota at the end of his career, too. All the guy did was score points everywhere he went. It's really amazing. August 25th, 2005, Minnesota acquires Eric Westrom, Dustin Wood. Arizona acquires Zdeněk Mihalik. That's a win for Arizona. It is. March 8th, 2006, Minnesota acquires a 2006 first-round pick who didn't play, and a 2007 third who also didn't play. And going the other way, Edmonton gets Dwayne Roloson. And I remember at the time of that trade, it was considered a steep price to pay a first-round pick for Roloson. It was considered kind of an older goaltender. And then Edmonton went on a run all the way to the Stanley Cup final. So it was considered to be a pretty good calculated risk by the Edmonton Oilers. And Roloson played pretty well for Edmonton for a while there. So, good deal for Edmonton. I wouldn't say it's a loss for Minnesota because they always have good goaltenders. So you move one out, you'll move another one in. On June 24th of 2006, Minnesota acquires Pavel Demitra. LA gets Patrick O'Sullivan and a 2006 first-round pick. So Demitra to Minnesota. July 1st, 2007, Minnesota gets Peter Kalis. Kalis was one of those guys that kept you wanting more. You knew there was some offense in there. You knew there was some kind of an upside there. And numerous teams did everything they could to try to make it work, and it just didn't. 2009 fourth, and Boston gets Manny Fernandez, which was kind of a mistake for Boston. But these things happen. On June 26, 2009, Minnesota acquires a first-round pick, which becomes Nick Leddy, and a third-round pick, and a seventh-round pick, which becomes Eric Howla. And going to the Islanders is a first-round pick in 2009, which becomes Calvin DeHaan. So just straight up looking at this deal now, I go, yeah, that's a win for Minnesota. Although Leddy, ironically, ends up in New York playing for the Islanders. June 27th, 2009, Minnesota acquires a 2009 sixth-round pick, which becomes Darcy Kemper. And the rights to Kyle Brodziak. Edmonton gets a 2009 fourth and fifth-round draft pick. So I'll take that as a win for Minnesota right there, even though Kemper never really realizes his full potential in Minnesota. Still pretty good, because again, Minnesota, pretty good goaltenders. On November 23rd, 2009, Minnesota gets Guillaume Latendresse. Montreal gets Benoit Pouliot, and Montreal will be the next team to get Pouliot and try to turn him into a big scoring forward, and we can get that offense out of him, and it just doesn't quite work. But I understand why teams kept trying. I liked him in Boston just fine, but I understand why teams move on as well. February 12th, 2010, Minnesota acquires Cam Barker. Chicago gets Kim Johnson and Nick Leddy. So that's a win for Chicago right there. Barker would have a promising start to his career and a couple of good seasons along the way, but ultimately would not last very long at the NHL level. June 26, 2010, Minnesota gets a 2010 second-round pick, which became Jason Zucker. Florida gets a third-round pick that year and a fourth, which is used to draft Jonas Donskoy, who, of course, now is a member of the Colorado Avalanche. June 24th, 2011, Minnesota gets Charlie Coyle, Devin Setaguchi, and a 2011 first, which became Zach Phillips, so not an NHLer. San Jose gets Brent Burns and a 2012 second-round draft pick. So this is a huge win for San Jose. I kind of understood the trade a little bit at the time, kind of. And Coyle did have a decent run with Minnesota. He had a really good year a couple years back. And in Boston, he showed he can still be potentially a top six forward. But of course, everybody looks at this as the Burns deal. It's really Setaguchi that was probably the one that was going to tip the scales. If Setaguchi became the top six forward he was supposed to be, then Minnesota likely wins this deal. Setaguchi, though, it didn't work out. And then that first-round draft pick, well, Phillips just... he didn't work as a professional hockey player in terms of getting to the National Hockey League, so it does become a very lopsided deal. But at the time, there was some risk for San Jose as well. July 3rd, 2011, Minnesota acquires Danny Heatley. San Jose gets Martin Havlat. By the time Heatley gets to Minnesota, he is not that same 50-goal forward he was in 2007. April 3rd, 2013, Minnesota acquires Jason Pominville and a 2014 fourth-round draft pick. Buffalo gets Matt Hackett. He's a goaltender who a lot of teams thought, okay, we can do this, and it just doesn't work. Johan Larsson, a 2013 first-round pick, which became Nikita Zadorov, and a 2014 second. So I'll go ahead and give Buffalo the edge on that one because Zadorov turns out to be a pretty darn good defenseman as well. June 30th, 2013, Minnesota gets Nino Niederreiter. The New York Islanders get Cal Clutterbuck and a 2013 third-round draft pick. Again, Niederreiter, that's a win for Minnesota, but temporarily because then they lose on the trade where he goes. June 14th, 2015, Minnesota acquires Devin Dubnyk. Arizona acquires a 2015 third-round draft pick. So, Devin Dubnyk, solid goaltender for them, and all they had to give up was a third-round draft pick to the Arizona Coyotes, who had played a major role in turning around Dubnyk's game. They just didn't really need him. February 26, 2017, Minnesota acquires Martin Hanzal, Ryan White, and a 2017 fourth. Arizona acquires Grayson Downing, a 2017 first, which became Joseph, who was just, of course, his rights were traded off to Pittsburgh this offseason, and Ball. And I have the second round pick, which became Ball, on the board because he may very well push for a roster spot with Arizona this year. At the time of this trade, I thought it was crazy. And Ryan White I saw as a throw-in. And then, of course, White got off to this really, really hot start. And I had people going, see, you said White was a throw-in, and he's awesome. And then it went ice cold. He went absolutely ice cold. It was an odd deal at the time. And again, it was a deal made by Minnesota thinking they were closer to being a champion than they were. And all they needed was a little bit of depth, and they'd be able to push further. And it didn't work out for them. June 21st, 2017, they traded Alex Tuch to Vegas for a third-round pick in 2018. And this is done... It's done because they wanted some kind of consideration at the expansion draft, and they wanted to make sure that certain players that were exposed weren't taken by Vegas. And Vegas is like, all right, fine. But Tuch is a pretty steep price to pay for that. They could definitely use Alex Tuch's offense right now in that lineup. June 30th, 2017, Minnesota acquires Tyler Ennis, Marcus Foligno, and a 2018 third-round pick. Buffalo gets Jason Pominville, Marco Scandella, and a 2018 fourth-round pick. So Buffalo gets back Pominville, who probably never should have left Buffalo in the first place. And Foligno's a solid addition for Minnesota, so we'll go with a 50-50 on that deal. January 17th, 2019, Minnesota acquires Victor Rask. Carolina acquires Nino Niederreiter. If you're going to acquire a player, you should scout him. And rumor has it that there was no scouting done on Victor Rask. They just knew they needed Nino out of the locker room because Nino and Bruce Boudreau were not on the same page. And, you know, Boudreau may have been glad to see him go, but I can't think he'd be much happier with Victor Rask. Rask, that contract is just going to be a miserable one to move. And I would expect Minnesota's going to be moving it sometime this year if they can find a taker. February 20th, 2019, Minnesota acquires Ryan Donato and a 2019 fifth-round pick in exchange for Charlie Coyle going to Boston. Short-term win for Boston. Coyle plays a pretty decent role in the Boston Bruins getting to the Stanley Cup Finals in 2019. Long-term, I like Donato's upside a lot. I think he's a good forward, and with the right coaching, I think he could be a really solid top six guy. February 25th, 2019, so 5 days after they get Donato, they acquire Kevin Fiala, and Nashville gets Michael Granlund back, which at the time we looked at and said, what? But Granlund, who apparently wants a pretty hefty raise next summer, his numbers in Nashville weren't very good. And Fiala's numbers in Minnesota were really similar to what Granlund did in Nashville. So right now, it's too early to call that trade. At the time, it looked like a huge win for Nashville, but right now, it looks like this coming season's going to tell us who really won that trade. At least with Fiala and Donato, they've got guys who are reasonably priced, young, and can still get better. So Minnesota's in that spot, and this is a tough position to be in, where they're good enough to be potentially a playoff team. They can patchwork this together and get into the playoffs. But would they be doing it and ending up being out in the first round again, as they have been so many times recently? Or can they get further? So that's the big question mark with Minnesota. And then the other one, which is, do they need to just kind of tear it down and do a quick retool along the lines of what the Rangers have been doing? Or do they need a full-on rebuild? And that's the key question that's going to be, I think, staring Paul Fenton in the face this coming February. But for now, we're all caught up. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And there you go. The history of the Minnesota Wild from 2000 to 2019. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I'll talk to you again very soon.